It begins with a photograph, faded at the edges, sepia-toned, tucked into an attic chest that hadn't been opened in decades. The faces staring back are familiar yet disturbingly strange, as though the camera caught more than a moment. It captured a secret. Look closely, and you might notice it too. The way the children all resemble one another, far beyond what genetics could explain. The way their smiles are almost mirrors of one another. The way the adults' hands hover protectively, possessively over them. You feel instinctively that something isn't right, that this isn't just a family. You've stumbled across a lineage that has lived with its own shadows, its own forbidden rules for generations. The story starts in a small town in the rural South, a place where everyone's history is intertwined with the land, and where the past isn't merely remembered, it lingers, sometimes like a specter. There, on the outskirts, sat a farmhouse that had been in the same family for over a century. Its paint was peeling, windows fogged with time, and a silence that seemed almost ceremonial hung in its air. This house, the locals whispered, was not just a home. It was a vault, and inside it held a story too dark, too intimate for the light of day. The patriarch, a man who had inherited the property from his father and grandfather before him, was known for his peculiar ways. He walked with a measured caution, his eyes scanning the horizon as if anticipating the return of something long absent. He kept meticulous records, letters, journals, and photographs, all catalogued with obsessive care. But the content of these records was rarely shared, and when pressed, the answers were vague. The townspeople, those who dared to ask, were told only that some truths are meant to remain buried. And buried they were until curiosity, persistence, or perhaps fate brought people like us to dig. The patriarch's family history was complex, woven with threads of isolation, secrecy, and something darker that whispered between the lines. The earliest ancestors of this line were settlers, taking to the frontier, carving farms and homesteads out of the wilderness. It was said that in those early days, survival meant insularity. Marriage outside the small, contained community was rare, and trust was a currency more valuable than gold. They learned, over time, that bloodlines could be controlled, monitored, even preserved. Generations later, that preservation took a form that modern society would never condone. In the journals we uncovered, the careful attention to family trees was meticulous, almost clinical. Every cousin, second cousin, distant relative, documented, charted, traced. Each union within the family was not just a matter of personal choice, but of necessity. Necessity dictated by rules older than the nation itself. These rules were never spoken aloud outside the house. They were written in ink, in secrecy, in a language of survival that no outsider could hope to understand. It's hard, even for historians, to confront the reality of inbreeding. We like to believe it's a relic of a distant past, a European or remote world problem. But here, in the heart of America, it existed quietly, almost imperceptibly. Children were born who were more like reflections than individuals, adults who carried a sense of unity that bordered on the uncanny. But along with this physical resemblance came a psychological one. Behaviors, desires, fears. They passed down like heirlooms, unbroken and unexamined, and sometimes that unity twisted into obsession. By the 20th century, the house had become both a refuge and a prison. The family existed almost entirely apart from the town, leaving only enough footprints to appear normal. Children were raised with a strict, almost ritualistic education in the ways of the house. Lessons were not just in reading and arithmetic, but in loyalty, secrecy, and the understanding of the lineage's peculiar rules. From a distance, they looked like any other family. From a closer, more careful inspection, you begin to notice the patterns, the way cousins marry cousins, the way their eyes reflect a strange familiarity, the way some conversations are carried in silence, and some thoughts never spoken aloud because speaking them would be dangerous. It was within this environment that the most controversial, the most whispered about unions took place. They were not casual, they were deliberate. Every pairing, every relationship was analyzed, recorded, and preserved within the family archives. And yet, despite, or perhaps because of the meticulous planning, the human heart did not always obey reason. Love, desire, and curiosity found their way into places where rules were strictest. And when it did, it blurred the lines between family and passion, between loyalty and obsession, leaving a mark that generations would feel but never fully acknowledge. If you try to imagine what it is like to grow up in such a household, it is almost unbearable. You are aware, always, that your parents, your uncles, your cousins are not just relatives. They are also instruments of a system designed to maintain purity. You see their eyes in the photographs and the journals, and you notice how knowledge of this system shapes every interaction. Childhood is not a place of innocence. It is a place of observation, of learning the rules silently, of understanding that love, family, and desire are all entangled in ways that are taboo outside these walls. And yet there is a strange loyalty, a devotion to the family that is as much fear as it is affection, as much duty as it is instinct. By the time the modern era arrived, this family had produced multiple generations living under the same roof, for at least within the same boundaries of secrecy. The journals, letters, and photographs that survive paint a picture of an existence both claustrophobic and meticulous, a life that the outside world cannot truly grasp. Outsiders who encountered the family often remarked on their unity, their unbreakable bonds, their almost telepathic understanding of one another, but those who looked closer, who tried to decipher the patterns in whispers, found themselves unsettled. The resemblance between the cousins, the way some children seemed to mimic their elders in unsettling ways, the hints of desire crossing boundaries that society had long condemned, these things could not be ignored. And yet, for decades, the house remained hidden, quietly growing, quietly maintaining its lineage. Letters from distant relatives sometimes appeared in the mailbox, ignored, returned, or hidden away in a drawer. Visitors were rare, and the family's presence in town was like a shadow, perceived but never fully understood. Stories emerge, always fragments, always whispered in fear, but no one dared investigate fully. Until now, until the day someone opened the chest in the attic, discovered the photographs, and began to trace the genealogy, one disturbing revelation at a time. It is in these moments, when the past collides with the present, that the true horror begins. Not the horror of a single act, not the shock of a single photograph, but the realization that generations lived this way, unbroken, unchallenged, sustained by silence, secrecy, and an almost fanatical devotion to the idea of bloodline. And when you begin to trace the connections, when you map the family tree as it really is, you start to see patterns that are more than coincidences. They are choices. Decisions made over decades, some deliberate, some inherited, all leading to an outcome that most of the world would call unnatural. The question that hangs in the air, unspoken yet impossible to ignore, is simple yet horrifying. At what point does family loyalty become something else? At what point does love, nurtured in isolation, cross the boundaries of morality and ethics? And when the line blurs, as it inevitably does in this house, how do the children, born into this web of blood, secrecy, and desire, understand who they are or who they are allowed to love? In the end, what we are left with is not just a story of inbreeding or taboo. It is a story of human obsession, of the power of secrecy, and of the fragile, terrifying boundaries between love and possession. It is a story that forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth. Some histories are hidden not because they are forgotten, but because they are too disturbing to ever be told aloud. And when they surface, as they have in this family, the result is a reflection of ourselves, a mirror we are never truly prepared to look into. By the time the mid-20th century arrived, the house had become more than a home. It was a fortress. The family rarely ventured into town, and when they did, they carried themselves with an almost imperceptible tension, a sense of belonging everywhere and nowhere at once. Outsiders noticed it vaguely, the way you notice a shadow out of the corner of your eye, but no one could put words to it. Behind closed doors, the family continued the practice that had defined them for generations, controlling the lineage, dictating unions, and preserving their blood in ways that modern society would condemn. The children, born into this world of quiet obsession, were taught the rules from an early age. They learned that every glance, every conversation, every touch carried meaning. Some lessons were subtle. A certain look meant acknowledgement, another meant disapproval. But some were not subtle at all. Certain pairings were encouraged, others forbidden, and all deviations noted meticulously in the family records. Those who strayed were punished, not always with violence, but with withdrawal, with the coldness of absence, with the weight of shame that descended like a shroud over the household. There are photographs from the 1940s that show children grouped together in ways that seem innocent at first glance. But when you study them closely, you notice details that unsettle the eye. The way hands rest on shoulders, the lingering touches that linger just a moment too long, the expressions that hint at knowledge and understanding far beyond their age. These were children who had grown up learning to read the body language of intimacy and control before they could even read a book, and in doing so, they absorbed the rules of desire as much as the rules of family. It is impossible to overstate the psychological weight of growing up in such an environment. Imagine a childhood where your first understanding of love is entwined with rules, with strategy, with loyalty that is as much fear as affection. Imagine learning that the world outside is dangerous not because of crime or misfortune, but because it threatens to dissolve the carefully constructed boundaries of your own bloodline. Every game, every smile, every gesture becomes part of a complex code, a web that binds the children to the family and the family to the lineage. By the 1960s, these patterns began to produce consequences that could no longer be hidden. Genetic anomalies started to appear, subtle at first, in ways that only an expert could recognize. Physical traits repeated themselves with alarming precision. Behavioral patterns, too, seemed amplified. Obsessive tendencies, social withdrawal, uncanny familiarity among cousins. These were signs of a bloodline stretched taut over decades, constrained by isolation and deliberate pairing. Yet still, the family persisted. They saw themselves as caretakers of a legacy, not as participants in a morally complex experiment. The outside world, if it noticed at all, remained largely oblivious. And then came the whispers, the small, accidental leaks of knowledge. Neighbors, once curious, began to share fragments of what they had noticed. The unusual closeness of certain cousins, the intensity of family bonds that defied typical definitions, the quiet avoidance of outsiders. The whispers were vague, sometimes tinged with fear, but always consistent in their implication. Something unnatural lived behind the white clapboard walls of that farmhouse. For decades, these fragments remained just that, fragments. No one outside the family dared to piece them together, until, inevitably, someone did. The person who first dared to trace the family tree in earnest discovered something almost unimaginable. Using photographs, journals, and letters, they mapped generations of intermarriage, unions that would be considered morally and genetically taboo by almost every standard outside the household. Cousins married cousins, sometimes multiple times in succession, creating a tangled web that resisted simple explanation. And yet, in the eyes of the family, it was normal, it was expected, it was necessary. Every step, every pairing, every birth was part of a long, running plan, meticulously calculated over decades to maintain the purity of blood. It is in this context that the question of cousins or lovers begins to emerge, and it is here that most outsiders recoil. The line between familial affection and romantic desire, so clearly drawn in ordinary life, is deliberately blurred in this household. Adults who are cousins, who share the same last names, who grew up under the same roof, are allowed, or sometimes even encouraged, to explore bonds that would horrify outsiders. Children observe, learn, and internalize these behaviors as part of the social fabric of the family. Love and blood, intimacy and loyalty all become entangled in ways that defy conventional morality. Some journals, written in painstaking detail, reveal the internal conflicts of family members who could not reconcile instinct with instruction. They speak of fascination, of desire, of guilt, of loyalty. One entry from the 1970s reads almost like a confession. I love her, and yet I fear the rules. The bloodline demands it, yet my heart resists. I do not know where the family ends and I begin. This duality, the collision of inherited obligation with personal emotion, is at the heart of the family's story. It is a psychological pressure cooker, one that leaves scars not visible to the eye, but deeply embedded in identity and self-perception. By the late 20th century, the family had accumulated a library of evidence, records, photographs, diaries, that could rival any historian's archive, yet no historian was meant to see it. These documents were kept under lock and key, passed from one generation to the next with instructions to guard them, protect them, and never reveal them. They contained intimate details of unions, of births, of forbidden relationships, all catalogued as part of the lineage. And hidden within these pages is the unspoken acknowledgement that the family is not just preserving itself, it is performing a ritual, a continuity of desire and obsession that has persisted longer than most communities can remember. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have followed the rules, kept silent, or attempted to break free? Because that is the choice every member of this family faces from the moment they are born: obey, conform, or risk the wrath of generations. As the generations progress, the consequences of this isolation and intertwining become more apparent. Psychological issues emerge: obsessive behavior, compulsive secrecy, blurred lines of trust. Physical anomalies become slightly more pronounced, though subtle enough to hide from outsiders. But perhaps most disturbing is the normalization of desire within the family. Where an ordinary person might recoil, the children here are taught to accept, to internalize, and sometimes even to replicate. The family becomes a self-contained ecosystem where normal definitions of morality no longer apply. And still, the family persisted. They navigated the social world outside their property carefully, sending just enough presence into town to appear normal while maintaining the isolation that sustained their lineage. They lived lives of quiet, almost ritualistic devotion to the rules passed down from ancestors who had long since vanished. Every photograph, every letter, Every whispered conversation served a dual purpose: to maintain continuity and to remind the next generation of the invisible walls they were never meant to cross. What emerges from these records is a portrait of a family both brilliant and tragic. Brilliant in its meticulous preservation of identity, tragic in the psychological and moral weight it imposes on each new generation. The story is not just one of genetic consequence. It is one of human obsession, of secrecy, and of the lengths to which people will go to maintain a sense of order, even when that order defies the world's understanding of right and wrong. And in this, the house on the outskirts of town is more than just a structure. It is a vessel of history, a monument to secrecy, a container of the unspeakable. Walking its halls, reading its records, examining its photographs, you feel the weight of decades pressing down, the whisper of forbidden truths that have been carefully hidden from the world. And somewhere in that weight lies the story of desire, of devotion, and of a family whose love is inseparable from its blood, whose obsession has carried it forward across generations in ways that are both mesmerizing and horrifying. By the turn of the 21st century, the house and its inhabitants had become almost a living archive, a repository of human behavior that no one outside could hope to understand. Every room contained evidence of lives meticulously tracked and controlled. Every photograph, every diary, every letter was a testament to a lineage that had been preserved at all costs, costs that were often invisible, psychological, and profoundly disturbing. The family existed in a delicate balance, the outside world barely aware, the internal world suffocating in its intensity, and each new generation born into a system they neither chose nor could fully comprehend. Children continued to be raised under strict scrutiny, their behavior observed, their interactions measured, their emotions catalogued. By adolescence, they knew instinctively which relationships were sanctioned and which were forbidden. And yet, despite, or because of this imposed order, human desire proved impossible to constrain. The family's own records reveal the tension, forbidden affection blossoming in secret corners, unspoken longings that could erupt into acts that the outside world would find shocking, even abhorrent. The journals read like psychological studies, detailed, clinical, yet haunted with emotion. The entries speak not just of love or lust, but of fear, guilt, and the almost unbearable weight of legacy. As the generations continued, patterns emerged that cannot be ignored. Siblings and cousins share uncanny similarities, not just in appearance but in thought and behavior. The family exhibits traits that seem genetically amplified: heightened instincts, obsessive attention to detail, an almost ritualistic approach to daily life. Yet alongside these traits are darker manifestations: emotional volatility, extreme loyalty bordering on fanaticism, and the subtle, pervasive influence of desire intertwined with bloodline. It is a psychological ecosystem unlike any other, one that thrives on secrecy, repetition, and unspoken rules. The deeper one digs into the family archives, the more unsettling the story becomes. Letters reveal internal conflict, confessions of transgression, moments of doubt, and fleeting resistance. One entry describes a young woman grappling with her feelings for a cousin. "I cannot deny the pull, yet I fear what the rules demand. Every thought is a crime, yet every glance betrays the blood that binds me." This tension, the collision of instinct, desire, and imposed morality, is the very heart of the household's darkness. It is a crucible in which love and taboo, loyalty and obsession are inseparable. By the 1980s and 1990s, the family had perfected their system of concealment. Outsiders remained oblivious, neighbors unaware of the full scope of what took place behind closed doors. Photographs, meticulously catalogued and hidden, became almost ceremonial in nature, preserving not just faces but intentions. Diaries, passed from parent to child, instructed the young in the art of secrecy. Even the smallest infraction could ripple across generations, recorded and referenced in subtle ways that shaped behavior. The house was no longer merely a home. It was a school, a prison, and a laboratory of human relationships. What makes this story particularly haunting is not simply the practice of inbreeding, nor the cataloging of forbidden desire, but the psychological consequences. Children raised in this environment internalize the family's rules in ways that blur identity. Love becomes indistinguishable from obligation, intimacy from manipulation. The family becomes a microcosm, a world apart where the very definition of normal is rewritten in secret. Adults speak of loyalty, yet it is often indistinguishable from control, of affection, yet it is inseparable from legacy. And the children, born into this web, grow up knowing instinctively what is permitted and what is not, yet unable to fully comprehend the moral and ethical boundaries of the larger world. There are stories of members leaving the house, attempting to escape the invisible chains of lineage. Few succeed, most are drawn back, either by guilt, fear, or the inescapable gravity of familial bonds. The journals speak of departures that end in silence, of letters returned unopened, of children who vanish into the outside world only to return years later, carrying the weight of knowledge they cannot share. The family is self-contained, a closed system, yet it is haunted by the awareness that each generation must confront the same psychological labyrinth. One of the most disturbing aspects of this lineage is the deliberate preservation of desire across generations. The family teaches that attraction between cousins is natural, sanctioned, and necessary. Observing this from the outside, it is almost impossible to parse the line between nurturing affection and romantic impulse. For the children within, it is normalized, internalized from birth, and codified in ritual, in ceremony, and in the meticulous records that mark every birth, every union, and every relationship. It is a system that perpetuates itself, a cycle that is impossible to break without severing identity itself. And yet, for all its darkness, there is a strange, tragic beauty in the story. The family's devotion to one another is unparalleled. Their bonds, however twisted by societal standards, are profound. They survive, thrive even, in a world that cannot understand them. They are the ultimate archivists of their own bloodline, historians of intimacy and obsession. Their lives, though haunting, are meticulously preserved in the photographs, journals, and letters that have survived decades, offering us a glimpse into a hidden corner of human experience that most of society will never dare to acknowledge. When we examine the modern descendants, the psychological imprint of generations is undeniable. Individuals carry the weight of history in ways that are subtle but profound. The instinctual adherence to rules, the uncanny ability to read another family member's thoughts, the repetition of patterns, both physical and behavioral. And beneath it all, the silent question persists. When family and desire intertwine so completely, where does one end and the other begin? In the end, what remains is a story of survival, secrecy, and obsession. A story that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the fragility of human morality, the persistence of inherited behavior, and the ways in which love can become inseparable from legacy. The house on the outskirts of that small town is more than just a home. It is a monument to human complexity, a repository of hidden history, and a chilling reminder that some truths are buried for a reason. Perhaps the most haunting lesson of all is this: history is not only written in textbooks, not only preserved in museums. Sometimes it is hidden in the walls of a house, in the photographs tucked away in an attic, in the journals never meant to be read. And when we finally confront these truths, as we have with this family, we are forced to stare into a mirror of ourselves, a reflection of desire, loyalty, obsession, and the unspoken boundaries we all carry. Somewhere within those walls, the family continues. Generations live, love, and endure under rules that defy the outside world. And somewhere beyond the boundaries of their property, the world remains unaware of the lineage that persists, a hidden chronicle of desire and devotion intertwined in ways too complex, too disturbing, to fully comprehend. We are left with questions, with unease, and with the quiet understanding that some stories are meant to haunt us long after the last photograph is taken, long after the last diary is closed, and long after the last whispered secret has been spoken. Because in the end, the question is never fully answered. Cousins or lovers, blood or desire, family or obsession, the lines blur. They have always blurred. And we are left to wonder whether we, too, could bear the weight of such a lineage, hidden deep beneath the soil, preserved in silence, and carried forward across generations that no one outside was ever meant to see.